Thank you guys for being here, and we are ending with a bang because we're gonna teach you guys all about climate change. Anybody rolling their eyes out there? Kind of feeling that. All right, so our next guest is speaking out on climate change, backing it up with facts. He's from the Climate Depot. He is also the author of The Great Reset, Global Elites, and The Permanent Lockdown. Please welcome Marc Morano.
Thank you. Thank you, Holly. Appreciate it. All right, thanks. Thank you very much. Right, testing one. All right, thank you very much. My name is Marc Morano. As she mentioned, I'm going to be doing a PowerPoint here. And I'm going to be talking about the climate-COVID connection, or the Great Reset in climate change, how they're using climate change to essentially reset our economic structure without a vote of Congress. Now, my family's from Pennsylvania. My mom is in the audience, is from Uniontown, Pennsylvania. My dad is from Scranton. My wife is from Philadelphia suburbs. And I've testified in your Pennsylvania EPA and also your House hearing under former Chairman Darrell Metcalfe many times in the State House here in Harrisburg. So you have a lot of great leaders in Pennsylvania. One of the greatest, that was one of the greatest House committees I've ever seen. He'd bring in about 8 climate skeptics and energy realists to testify. But my topic today is the Great Reset, Global Elites and the Permanent Lockdown. Let me see, it's trying to advance here. Anyway, well, my book is on that. It's on this, and what they've done is they've combined the two issues. First of all, this is not having this work. Okay, this is who I am. I work at Climate Depot. That's me at UN summits. I have a lot of fun. I brought a cardboard cutout of Donald Trump when he first won the election in 2016 to the UN summit in Marrakesh, Morocco. And the United Nations Armed Climate Cops, you see me there with the red hat, they turned me out into the desert in Morocco and banned me from the conference after that. I was shredding the UN Paris Climate Agreement, had a lot of fun. So this is the Great Reset. Now you might say, what's the Great Reset? What's that? What I'm going to tell you today is how you're hearing a lot about what's happening in Pennsylvania, even our country. I'm going to talk about the forces outside the United States that are influencing us and are making decisions for Pennsylvanians without a vote of democracy. And that's ultimately what the Great Reset is. So this is from the World Economic Forum, and here's how it's going to be affecting your life. When COVID first hit and your governor started locking down, and sadly one of the worst states along with Michigan, New York, in terms of COVID repression mandates, Klaus Schwab, the head of the World Economic Forum, was very clear. He said that COVID represented a rare, narrow window of opportunity to reflect, reimagine, and reset our world. You'll own nothing and you'll be happy. This was the slogan of the World Economic Forum, and they mean it, because as they're now shutting down farms in the Netherlands, as equity asset firms are buying up real estate in major cities and suburbs, they're turning owners into renters. This is part of the plan. Whatever you'll rent, it'll be delivered by drone. Their idea is for you to stay at home. Does that sound familiar? Stay-at-home orders. The U.S. won't be the world's leading superpower. We heard that from many other speakers today. China is positioning itself as the new superpower as we shoot ourselves in the foot constantly. There'll be a global price on carbon. Make fossil fuels history. We're going to be looking at energy shortages. They're going after meat eating. Meat as an occasional treat, not a staple for the good of the environment. So, the Great Reset essentially is restricting energy, food, transportation, free speech, property ownership, and our financial system. We had speakers talking about environment, social governance, ESG. But here's what's going on. Since March of 2020, the reason Jane Fonda is on record as saying COVID is God's gift to the left is very simple. It created chaos in America. And why is chaos good for a Great Reset, for a progressive agenda? As Vladimir Lenin used the phrase, worse is better, in Tsarist Russia for the Bolshevik Revolution, the idea is the more chaos you can create in a society, critical race theory, transgender ideology, the vaccine and mask mandates, and COVID theater for your kids, the more you can actually impose your vision of tyranny because people are confused, mixed up, and they're living in chaos. So what happened in COVID, and this is the key tenet, and I think this will resonate, the once free West copied China's one-party authoritarian rule. We were told by the World Health Organization, by Anthony Fauci, by the entire public health establishment that we had to copy China's response to COVID, which meant lockdowns, stay-at-home orders, school closures, closing of churches, canceling of medical procedures, closing, stay-at-home orders, curfews from governors. The most restrictions we'd ever faced in our lifetimes, probably since World War II with the wartime powers. But this ultimately led to a bypassing of democracy. Governor Wolf in Pennsylvania was able to issue emergency decree and shut down anything he wanted. There wasn't an ounce of democracy in anything I just mentioned. It was imposed upon you. And that's what the Great Reset is, trying to continue that. So the once free West has now lusted after Chinese one-party rule. The global elites, this is the pages of the New York Times, Tom Friedman on record as saying that China, one-party rule, they can impose politically difficult but critically important policies needed. The New York Times lead columnist has praised China's one-party authoritarianism. The UN climate chief has lamented U.S. democracy, said it was detrimental to fighting global warming. They lauded one-party rule China for doing it right. This is happening over the last few decades. Apple CEO has praised China. China aligns completely with Apple's values. Do you see what's happening here? It's not just fighting big government anymore. We're fighting big government corporate collusion. That's the key here. Justin Trudeau, Canadian Prime Minister. There's a level of admiration I have for China because their basic dictatorship allows them to turn their economy around on a dime. I had some fun there with Fidel Castro pictures and Justin Trudeau morphing. Just 2 weeks ago, Biden's energy secretary claimed the U.S. can learn a lot from China on climate change. Does that sound familiar? We can learn a lot on their lockdown policy, and now we can learn what they're doing on climate change. Well, this is the Great Reset. When they locked us down, the workers in the world of America lost $3.7 trillion, while billionaires gained $3.9 trillion. It was the largest transfer of wealth from poor and middle class to the wealthy as they crushed mom and pop, small businesses, and corporate chains, big tech. All of those prospered immensely during this lockdown. So Australia was one of the most authoritarian next to China. It was Canada, Australia, New Zealand, some of the worst. But Australia, they were able to prohibit free movement of people, put people in quarantine through track and trace apps. People, if you went to a grocery store, you could later get a buzz 12 hours later saying you were near someone who later tested positive. You're heading to a 10-day quarantine camp. Who would want to follow that model? Well, there's one person who would. Bill Gates has said when the next pandemic comes, we will follow what Australia did. He picked the #2 country, the most tyrannical response, as the way to fight the next virus. Now, why do we care what Bill Gates says? He is the #1 or #2 funder of the World Health Organization, depending on how you count it up, next to the United States government. He might surpass the U.S. government when you add up all the other groups he supports. So this is the man financing the single largest financer of the World Health, telling the world and public health bureaucracy that we are going to be following the world on following what Australia did. Central bank digital currency, they were talking about environment, social governance earlier. Biden last year issued an executive order to examine it. And central bank digital currency is a frightening concept because the Bank of England said the quiet part out loud. They told their finance ministers that it was, quote, the government will deem what you can spend your money on has to be sensible. So the Bank of England is telling you it won't work, your card won't work if you go buy gas, meat, something that's unapproved by the climate or the woke agenda. They will shut down your spending. We saw how it worked in Canada. Justin Trudeau picked up the phone. He declared the trucker convoy a terrorist organization, domestic terrorist threat. First time in Canadian history that they had ever invoked the Emergencies Act. And then he called up banks and insurance companies and said, hey, freeze their bank accounts. The corporate banks had no problem. They were right on it. This wasn't cutting off government services. Justin Trudeau cut off the truckers' access to their own money in their own bank account with corporate government collusion. That's what we're looking at. If you didn't get COVID vaccines around the world, you couldn't refuel your cars, you couldn't get money out of your account. The United Nations and the MasterCard have joined forces now to do this is a sort of a form of ESG, a card that monitors your carbon footprint. And guess what happens when you hit your carbon max? You literally, the card cuts off your ability to spend money. This is where we're headed. Corporate government collusion, we know this is factual, all the Freedom of Information Act requests. We're seeing this every day with the Twitter files, with all the freedom of information against the Biden administration listing, we want these people banned off social media. Big tech was like, yes, they're off, who else do you have? Complete collusion. Big tech censorship is government censorship. John F. Kennedy, this is the key quote, "For a nation that is afraid to let its people judge the truth in falsehood in an open market is a nation that is afraid of its people." And sadly, that is where we have become today. We are afraid to let people. That's where you get, this is misinformation. People can't be allowed to see it. They can't handle the truth. This is how far we've come as a nation. He said this in 1962, I believe, at the 20th anniversary of Voice of America. So all I really didn't know about COVID, I learned in the climate debate. And that was actually a book from 1985, All I Need to Know in Kindergarten. I changed the word kindergarten to the climate change debate. So in the climate debate, we learned that activists want you to panic. That's Greta Thunberg. And why does she want you to panic? Because when you panic, you can't make rational decisions. You can't make evidence-based decisions. You just get emotional and you make decisions. In the COVID debate, the activists wanted you to panic. This is the UK virus modeler who predicted, tens of millions dead. Bill Gates warned of 30 million dead. They wanted us to panic so that we would give up our rights and our democracy, and frankly, it worked. In the climate debate, billionaires bought the media. These are NPR, bought by Facebook's Zuckerberg, Rockefeller Foundation, funding NPR's climate coverage. In addition, the Associated Press is getting millions of dollars from foundations, billionaire-funded foundations. Our media is bought and paid for on climate, and the media is bought and paid for on COVID and public health. Bill Gates tens out tens of millions of dollars annually for positive media coverage. In the climate debate, the UN and the government are your single source of truth. This was actually what the UN said last fall. I went to the Egyptian Climate Summit. We own the science, and the world should know it. Of course they do. So how do you do it? How does the world know it? They partnered with Google, who loved the idea. So now when you look up climate change on Google, you're going to get only UN-approved messaging for the first several pages. That's how fascism is done. That's how corporate government, NGO, non-government organizations, collusion happens. In the COVID debate, the public health and governments were your single source of truth. These are actual quotes from New Zealand Prime Minister. We continue to be your single source of truth. So that's how misinformation works. If you say something against the government narrative, it's by definition now misinformation. Anthony Fauci, of course, said if you criticize him, he represents the science, you're criticizing the science. In the climate debate, Big Al is watching you. Al Gore teamed up with, who else? Google, and they have tens of thousands of satellites now tracking individual emitters of carbon dioxide. Pretty scary stuff. They know everything that's going from these satellites. Well, in the COVID debate, we had the same thing, track and trace apps following our cell phones. The COVID and climate connection runs very deep. And this is where it gets even more sinister. Climate lockdowns. In 2013, actual quote from a top UN official, the only way we can meet the United Nations climate goals is to shut down the whole global economy. Think about that, 2013, no one paid much attention. Oh, that's a rhetorical flourish. What happened 7 years later? Anyone want to guess, by the way, what happened? The whole global economy was shut down with COVID. And they loved it so much. We had activists in Teen Vogue magazine. If we can shut down the world for a virus, we can do the same for climate. And they meant it. This is actual headline, UK Guardian. Global lockdown every 2 years needed to meet the Paris climate goals. This is the mentality of our ruling class, of academia, of the media, of our government. Now, people say, oh, it's a conspiracy theory, climate lockdowns. Where did you come up with that? A Bill Gates, George Soros funded professor, Mariana Mazzucato, University College of London, in September 2020, coined the phrase climate lockdown. She said the world may have to resort to lockdowns again, this time to tackle the climate emergency, overhaul economic structures, ban consumption of red meat, limit private vehicle use. Are you seeing where this is going? This is what they're trying to do, if we allow it. Senator Schumer in Washington has urged Biden to declare a national climate emergency. Remember, under the COVID national emergency, it turned every governor into a petty dictator who could bypass the legislator. Well, if Joe Biden declares a national climate emergency, which there's rumor he is, according to the Associated Press, Washington Post, it would grant him 130 new powers of the judiciary, of the executive branch. The International Energy Agency urges behavioral changes, a shift away from private car use, upper speed limits, thermostat controls in your house. We already saw that in Colorado. Limits on your hot water use. The UK-funded report, this was actually funded by the UK government, urged a form of climate lockdown: stop flying, no new roads, airport closures, stop eating meat, doing anything that causes emissions. The last one is chilling. Regulate CO2 similar to asbestos. Well, as humans, we inhale oxygen, we exhale carbon dioxide. They're talking about regulating human breath as a toxic pollutant. Journal Nature, COVID lockdowns are key to begin personal carbon allowances, restrictions on individuals unthinkable, more prepared to accept tracking and limits. COVID is the response. 230 medical journals have said the global response to the pandemic could be a template for the necessary response on climate change. In other words, bypass democracy, massive government mandates, cutting off driving, food, agriculture. This is what they're thinking. And these are the major organs. This is the journal Nature. This is the British Medical Journal, not some Greenpeace blogger. You will go nowhere and be happy. Daily Mail, UK Prime Minister's Transportation Secretary, we must move beyond the idea of car ownership. It's outdated 20th century thinking. We need to get rid of cars completely, says Business Insider. Australian banks are banning loans for gas-powered cars. And then if you do have a car and you say, well, I'm not going to give up my car, well, guess what? They start banning gas stations. That's happening in Colorado. It's happening in California cities. So you say, I'm as a Pennsylvanian, I'm not going to give up my car. It's not up to you. They're taking the choice away. They're taking your democracy away. The World Bank is saying they're not going to fund gas-powered cars. Corporate banks aren't going to give loans. Automakers are colluding with government to stop it. They're mandating the electric car, allegedly, by 2035, if we allow it. All right, I need to go next one. All right. And then I have here, this is the slide from, that's Cuba on the left. So when you ban gas-powered cars, you end up with a 1950s style Cuban cars. That's what they have in Cuba. On the right is the crappy East German Trabant. If anyone remembers in East Germany, they were up to 10-year waiting lists for the one government-approved car, which was the Trabant. Now, of course, it's the one government-approved car, the electric car. So the great food reset, Bill Gates is competing with China. There's worry about a Chinese-owned agricultural land monopoly. Well, guess what? China lost out. A homegrown American beat China as the #1 landowner of farms in America, and that's Bill Gates. Here he is again, Bill Gates. He's #1 funder of World Health, and now he's the single largest farmland owner in America, according to NBC News. And he's not the one in overalls. What is Bill Gates' agenda? Very specific. He wants you to eat lab-grown synthetic meat, not the Impossible Burger made from vegetables. I'm talking about lab-grown meat made from stem cells from a cow and calf, grown in a steel vat. That's what Bill Gates is up to, and he's trying to force that upon us. The great diet reset, fake meat. One of the ways you do it, you print it on a 3D printer. Hey, honey, what's for dinner? Oh, I'm printing it up now. It takes 7 kilograms an hour, 6 kilograms of meat an hour. Meat in quotes. So, good grub. They're also pushing eating insects. This includes CNN, corporate media giving insects to kids in school. The Wall Street Journal sadly says to save money, you should skip breakfast. As they're collapsing high-yield agriculture in the Netherlands and other places, they're making food scarce. This is key. Harvard Public School of Health, the root causes of climate also increase the risk of pandemics. So if you don't support the Green New Deal, you're a grandma killer. That's what that means. And that's coming from Harvard University. Now they want, this is Harvard as well, Harvard Environmental Law Review. This paper just came out this week. Climate homicide, deaths for climate, prosecuting big oil for climate death. This happened 2 years ago. A doctor first clinically diagnosed case of climate change, a lady suffering from heat stroke. So you can be charged with homicide. A doctor can diagnose you with climate change. And look at this. You can now have it as a cause of death on your death certificate. I'm not making any of this up. This is in our academic mainstream now, this thinking. Of course, the last 100 years, climate change has had a 99% drop in climate-related deaths. And they're now to be afraid because the Biden administration is pushing the U.S. in a pandemic treaty where it won't matter who your governor is, who your mayor is. This will be coming international, global instant lockdowns. So next up is having a baby, pure environmental vandalism. They're coming for our kids. This is Vogue magazine. They're trying to set the idea that kids are destroying the planet. And the New York Times, if you do have kids, better have short ones. There's never been a time to be short. Not making this up. They're saying smaller people have lower carbon footprints, so we need to breed for smaller people. You can't make this up. It's a new form of climate eugenics coming from the New York Times. Anyway, to wrap up, speechless. If you're speechless because of all this, that's because climate change is the cause. It's accelerating language loss, of course. So keep calm and trust the experts. The New York Times cautions critical thinking leads to misinformation. Don't go down that rabbit hole of critical thinking. That's bad. You got to listen to the experts. You must not do your own research when it comes to science. And questioning authority has become too much of a good thing. Whenever someone in authority says something, just accept it. If you see Fauci, accept it. Slate magazine, it's time to give up on facts, or at least temporarily, and use emotions instead. Remember, I want you to panic. That's what Greta says. So, the Great Recess, we need it to be the Great Resist. I will say this, the greatest power of resistance against this whole agenda was the parents at school board meetings. Angry parents declared domestic terrorists by the Biden administration. They toppled the Democrat Party machine in Virginia and nationally and led to the lifting of vax and mask mandates in every city from San Francisco, LA, Baltimore, Washington, New York, and LA, because of the angry parents at the school board level. So, with that message, thank you very much. We can resist this agenda, the Great Resist. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.